All right, so last week we got into one of my favorite words. My wife's upset with me right now, so let's talk about that for a moment. So she knows that my favorite Hebrew word is chesed, and so she made me a T-shirt that has it on it with all the different definitions of it, and she's pretty upset that I'm not wearing it. I said, well, if you would have put on a polo, I probably could have worn it, but. So last week we started talking about this idea of chesed. And before I throw out any reminders, what is your takeaway from anything you do remember from last week? Any takeaways?
So chesed always uses a verb as an action.
Yeah, it's always an action. Always something that someone is doing to somebody. Here, I'll put this over here.
May I answer?
Yeah.
I look at that as God's divinity when it comes to love, the all-encompassing. Everything that he does is for how he feels for his creation.
Yeah.
It's bigger than we can fathom with our little tiny brains.
Yes. Yeah, in a sense. But it was also this term or this concept is a ancient Near Eastern concept in the sense of when it comes to neighborly duties, when it comes to familial duties, when it comes to contracts, but it's bigger than that. But God obviously epitomizes things in ways that are above our knowledge and understanding. Yeah, so it's not, so what you do when you do kindness to somebody, there is no return action. Now, oftentimes, you are appealing to someone's kindness based upon a previous kindness. But as we talked about last week, that's usually in secondary. You're forming new allies, new friendships, or, you're in a short-term, we're going to call it a short-term business contract, like with Rahab and the spies. Right? I'm going to deal kindly to you. Now, and I'll get you in a second, the request is that they would deal kindly back, but it's really up in the air. And you're wholly dependent upon the other person to do it. Usually only that person is capable or a person in that position.
I think you mentioned also there was something unique about it because the person who's giving the hesed or acting upon it was uniquely qualified to do that, whereas it was not something general. It was something very specific that they had the ability to do that somebody else couldn't fulfill.
Yeah, it's usually specific. It's usually, once again, it's like when I say only this person can do it, usually it's a person or a position, right? Maybe you're asking of a king or a dignitary or, like the spies. It could have been any two spies, like with Rahab. It could have any, but only them. None of the other people in the surrounding area could have fulfilled what was being asked of. And once again, those are normative terms. There may be some exceptions to that, but yeah.
So you're referring to something kind of like spiritual gifts. I was told, well, if certain people have certain gifts and you walk onto the scene, Jesus is going to give you what you need until you can get to that person that knows more about it or is more equipped spiritually to help them.
Yeah, and this
is it like
okay.
That?
So, let's say even getting away from religious context for a moment. This is let's say you have a neighbor who has a land, and you're having a land maybe disagreement, right? Or something has happened. Where, perfect example. There's a neighbor who has a tree that has fallen, right? And it's half on their property and half on their property. And you have an agreement, there is a previous agreement, a kindness, something, where in which this neighbor, he's the only person who can clean up that tree, at least his half of the tree, right? Whatever. But let's say he owns that tree. Once again, the illustration can fall apart real quick if we go too far. But the neighbor, you can't go and ask some other neighbor on the other side because there's nothing that he has to do with that tree, right? Like when Abraham was asking Sarah, do this kindness to me, and when we go into Egypt, call me your brother. Sarah is the only one who could fulfill that obligation. Okay? So, spinning all the way, well, let's see if there's any other remarks before I go any further. Anyone else, anything else that was of particular note from last week? I wanted to bring up something that Rick said, and the distinguishing nature of this love versus God's unconditional love. The unconditional Hebrew word is ahava, meaning God's going to love you no matter what you do, right? Kind of like you would love your child no matter what you do. But this kind of love, this kind of mercy, this kind of compassion is it's between a covenant people. It's between a person who's in a covenant. And that covenant can be either a big covenant like with God, or like I said, small, contractual, one-time covenants, and there's usually a mercy or compassion component. And once again, one of the reasons why it is, if you go to your translation, sometimes it's translated mercy, compassion, kindness, steadfast love, is because we don't have we don't really have a one-to-one English term for this type of relationship, because we just don't have them, right? We just don't think in terms like this. And so it's kind of described more than it is translated, right? Because kindness, what can kindness mean? Kindness can mean just about anything, right? You can be kind to a cat, right? You can be kind to someone for no reason, but when I do this kindness to me, or do this mercy to me, once again, you're calling upon a unique relationship or a unique understanding that this person has where they are, and you are completely and wholly dependent on this person to fulfill it, okay? And so when God performs chesed, usually it's at times of Israel's weakness. It's usually at times when Israel's completely lost, and God does a kindness for them, right? And God expects, like in Hosea, he expects them to return that loyalty, right? Because God can't do things to himself, right? In the sense of what he asked Israel to do. And so Israel's uniquely qualified to live out loyalty because they are God's covenant people. He's not going to go ask Nineveh to do it, right? He's not going to go ask Samaria to do it. He's not going to go ask all these other nations. Israel is uniquely qualified to be the people of God because of the covenant made. And so God expects chesed from them. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, so I'm going to kind of go backwards a little bit, or I'm going to go forwards and then backwards. I want to read Psalm 138 before we get into all of this beautiful drawing by yours truly. I know I've missed my calling of map making. I should have made treasure maps for a living. Psalm 138. And somebody, and I want you to read this slowly and purposely, read Psalm 138. It's the whole chapter, just 8 verses. And I want, when you're listening to this, I want you to be listening for God's kindness, steadfast love, depending on the translation someone's using, mercy, compassion, connected with his presence. Because ultimately, what have we been talking about this class? We're talking about the presence of God. So tonight we're going to be connecting God's loyalty with his presence. And hopefully it all makes sense when we come together. So somebody read Psalm 138.
All right, Psalm 138. I will praise thee with my whole heart before the gods. Will I sing praise unto thee? I will worship toward thy holy temple and praise thy name for thy loving kindness and for thy truth. For thou hast magnified...
So loving kindness is the chesed.
Okay. For thou hast magnified thy word above all thy name. In the day when I cried, thou answered me and strengthenedst me with strength in my soul. All the kings of the earth shall praise thee, O Lord, when they hear the words of thy mouth. Yea, they shall sing in the ways of the Lord, for great is the glory of the Lord. Though the Lord is high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly, but the proud he knoweth afar off. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, thou wilt revive me. Thou shalt stretch forth thine hand against the wrath of mine enemies, and thy right hand shall save me. The Lord will perfect that which concerneth me. Thy mercy, O Lord, endureth forever. Forsake not the works of thine own hands.
And the mercy is chesed again. So do you see this drawing on? First, it starts off in the second verse, or the first mention of the steadfast love or loving kindness chesed, is where is he putting his face towards when he's asking for God's chesed? His holy temple, right? Going into the presence of God, and the one who is giving the prayer is receiving blessings from the holy temple, which a temple is a place that does what? It houses the presence of God. And at the very end, it talks about this idea that those who are walking with you, who have the steadfast love, the loving kindness, the mercy, he regards them, he brings them close, his arm can stretch to reach them, but the haughty is what? Far from him, right? Far from him, and he does not regard them. They are not in his presence. To be in his presence is also to have his loyalty love, is to have his chesed, is to have his kindness, his mercy, right? But being far off, the moment you are outside of that presence, what also do you lose? You lose the chesed. Okay? So we're thinking in relationship terms, right? We're not talking about proximity according to miles, right? We're not talking necessarily, now he uses that as an example, but we're not talking about being in Jerusalem at the actual location of the temple, right? He is talking about how God's Spirit is with God's people, how God's presence is with people, and no matter where he is, even in the midst of enemies, where is God found? He's there. And what can you know you can call upon even in the midst of your enemies? What can you call upon? God's steadfast love or his mercy, right? And it's not just, we define mercy as, how does it usually defined?
Forgiveness for something that's not deserved.
All right, so kind of an undeserved, right? Grace and mercy usually kind of get conflated a little bit. But this is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about something that's undeserved. We're not talking about mercy that's undeserved. We're actually talking about a mercy that you can call upon and you can expect God will do for you because you are where? In the presence of God. So these two are interconnected. And that's one of the reasons why prayer is so powerful for those who are in Christ. Because if you call upon God, if you ask upon God, it's not that God has to. It's that God is a God who is loyal, who is chesed, who enters into these covenants. And when he makes promises and saying that I will do these things, at times of distress you're able to call, God, do this kindness to me. Now, we are wholly dependent on God doing that, aren't we? But as we talked about this morning, there's an expectation based upon the kind of God that we serve. Okay? Does that make sense? But those who are far off, right, and far off being outside of God's presence and away from the temple, they cannot call on God with the same expectation unless they are, a lot of the Psalms will say, unless they turn their face towards God. And God then turns his face towards them. Then chesed begins. Do you see how this goes beyond the conditional or unconditional? This is a conditional love based upon God and his promises. All right. Let's get to my wonderful drawing. We're going to go to Exodus chapter 32, my favorite story in Scripture. And not my favorite because of what happens, my favorite because of the implications. Okay? So first, Exodus begins in Exodus chapter 19 and 20. God is on a mountain. And when God's on the mountain, we got all these people, right? This represents people. Like that? Some are big, some are small. Some have Never mind. All right, start big, start small. They've come to the mountain, but tell me what's going on. If you were to explain the first Mount Sinai experience that Israel has when they come out of Egypt, how would you explain it?
God's presence on the mountain.
Okay, God's presence on the mountain.
People gather.
Huh?
They lost faith in God.
Okay, losing faith, but you talk about gathering.
They were gathering for the event.
Yeah.
They wanted something, and they knew there was something there they needed. So
Well, they actually were
they were
approaching
going.
this mountain, and all of a sudden, kaboom, right? God's presence comes down, he begins to speak, and there's fear. There's fear. Fear cannot be in relation with Hesed. Fear and Hesed do not go hand in hand. You may be afraid of something external, but when you're calling upon someone who is in this close primary Hesed, you don't fear this person. That's why you're going and requesting, right? It's why you actually have hope that they will return the favor, that they will do this kindness for you, is because there is a relationship already established. You do not go up to a stranger and call upon this relationship once again. Rahab and the spies, they've kind of entered into it. There's a unique kind of little pact that she's trying to ask. And she's calling upon a Hebrew idea, trying to get them to fulfill something. But that's besides the point. But so they come to the Ten Commandments, and there's fear. All right? And we know what happens. Moses goes, and immediately, right after this, we get the instructions for the tabernacle. What's the tabernacle? What's the tabernacle? It's the place where God's presence would dwell, right? Before the temple. The tabernacle is kind of a temporary residence, right? One that can be picked up and moved, and there was a way in which they were to move that. Very special. But have you ever gone and read the 15-some chapters that describe the building of the tabernacle? What kind of materials used? Expensive, lots of gold. Where did they get all these expenses? Okay, so keep that right here. Just come, right? All the gold that they've received from when they left Egypt, and the Egyptians are like blessing them completely. All of this was to be made, instructions to be made for the tabernacle. Okay? So immediately after the instructions are given, the tabernacle's not made yet. Moses goes back up to the mountain. Moses and Aaron, right? Some of the priests are able to go up a little bit. And how long is he up there? Huh? 40 days. Now, in the Bible, when you see the word 40, what are you supposed to be thinking of? Huh? Okay, tempted. Jesus was tempted for 40 days. It's a time of testing. Okay, the number 40, it's used so many times, it's almost as if, and once again, I'm not going to get into that. It doesn't have to be 40 for them to use the number 40. Does that make sense? They use it as a representative number. Like with Nebuchadnezzar being in the wilderness for 7 years. Why did they choose the number 7? Well, it could be that he was there for 7 literal years. Or 7 also in the Bible means complete. The time in which it took him, and it could be both. It could just happen that every complete number happens to be in a series of 7, or there are 40 days up, 40 days in the wilderness, Elijah for 40 days, right, and just keep compounding the 40, Jesus tempted for 40, right, but it's more significant than the exact time period. Right? Because there are some who would say that the wilderness was probably only 38 years and so many months. Well, does that matter? 40, the way an ancient Near Eastern historian would record events, is not the way a Westerner who wants to know the exact day and time, right? It's used to portray something. So numbers mean things. And the book of Revelation, by the way, takes full advantage of it. And Isaiah takes full advantage of it. Ezekiel takes full advantage of those numbers and really uses them to kind of cast some images. Anyway, so Moses ascends. He's up there for 40 days, and the people are being tested. That's what you're seeing. Now, how do they prevail with that test. They don't. They take, what do they finally convince Aaron to make? What gold do they use? The gold, right, that showed them that they received at slavery, right? The ones that were wearing some of their earrings, which once again were slave brands as well as the earring. But the gold that was also requested of to make the tabernacle. Do you see what's going on? Do you see there's a bigger picture here? They are wanting, once again, God is trying to build a place. I want to dwell with my people. Once again, it's always God directing the dwelling. God is always the one initiating. I want to come dwell with you, though here are my conditions. And he tells them to make this tent, using all these fancy jewelry and gold and things that have to smelt down, and right? Moses ascends, 40 days, they take it and they make a golden calf. Okay? God finds out about it. Not very happy when he's up there, sends Moses back down. We know all the things that come about. By the way, so let's go to Exodus 33, and we're going to kind of get to right here. Now, Moses leaves the mountain, and he goes to the tent of meeting. What's the tent of meeting?
Isn't that like the tabernacle, but just for him and people?
It's like the tabernacle. Anyone else?
The one where just the higher priests were supposed to be doing sacrifices?
That's the tabernacle. That's the holy place. Right? The tabernacle is divided into two sections, the holy place and the most holy place. And the most holy place is where the presence of God is, and only the high priest could go there once a year. But what's the tent of meeting?
Sounds like where city council meets. It sounds like an official assembly.
Sounds like it, and there is a meeting that goes on where not anybody, but where people go to meet the Lord. Moses. Moses at this time, which is one of the reasons why when Deuteronomy 18 and 19 talk about how there is someone who's coming that will be like Moses, Moses has some unique things that he's able to do that other people don't. But the tent of meeting, does anyone know where it's positioned? Where it's positioned. It's outside the, right? It's outside the tent. So you've got all the, right? You got the, tabernacle will soon be in the middle. You've got all the tribes, right, that camp in a specific military, by the way, order. And the tent of meeting is outside the tabernacle. So Moses would have to, or outside the camp, outside the camp. He goes out and he meets God. And the cloud will descend on the tent of meeting. And normally, back in Exodus, we realize in Exodus chapter 9, that when Moses goes out there, everybody comes out of their own tent, and they face the tent of meeting, and they offer up worship while Moses is talking to God. But it is where Moses would go to get instructions from the Lord. I find it interesting, and this is just a note. He leaves one place where he's speaking to God, and he goes to another place to speak to God. Anyone find that significant?
I do.
What?
I believe that meeting place, not the tabernacle, not the Holy of Holies, but the outer place, the tent that you so eloquently drew.
Thank you.
I believe
She helped me with the tent pegs, by the way.
I believe that that's to be seen. That's not for Moses to know, because Moses already knows he's there. The tent they go into and everybody looks at, that's to be seen, so the others can see that there is a place you can go that you can be with God. It's a spectacle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that definitely is a part of it, but this was pretty much a spectacle. I mean, he's up on a mountain, and there's a thunderous cloud, and when he speaks, what happens? Boom, right? Anyone else?
Even though God would know it, I think perhaps he sent Moses to see how bad it really was. That's what he can. And so this is what that's what I'm telling you. He's already told Moses, but he's telling him again. So this is what I'm dealing with. These are renegade people. And
Okay. Don?
Everything else, tabernacle,
Hold on.
Trying to get people to...
everything
Hey,
else.
Don, why don't you walk up here?
The tabernacle, the encampment and all is mainly Jewish. It's all God's covenant people. But going outside that, where he's talking to God in a different atmosphere. So it's separate and apart from the Jewish covenant.
Okay. Which, by the
promise.
way, becomes a huge significant phrase in the book of Hebrews of Jesus being sacrificed outside the camp. Okay? So, all the people are around. Okay? So they're outside of their normal camp. You've got the tent of meeting. Moses comes down and he walks out of Israel. He leaves the camp to go meet God outside of the camp of Israel. In the wilderness, which is where they are, right? And where God is going to, let's read, and we'll tie that back in a moment. Just keep that in mind. Look at verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people from whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you. I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments, which, by the way, those are the ornaments most of them took off to break down to build this. They're going back to their pre-slave era, right, or their slave era. For the Lord had said to Moses, "So say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up. Each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses. By the way, this is why you know this book was written many years later, because the author is recounting things that would have happened. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of the cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. The Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar, so it goes on and it talks about all these things. Now, so it's giving you a little history lesson. Look at verse 12. So now Moses, so you got to remember you're in an image. All the people are where? Here. Now, the last couple verses was just, this is how it normally operates. But the people are still where? They're still here. They have not gone out. We're still in this scene. God leaves. He says, you know what? I'll send you to the promised land, but I will not go with you. And so Moses then goes to the tent of meeting outside the camp. There's a sense in which God has already left the presence of whom? The people. He's leaving it. Okay? He's going outside of it. And Moses is like, it's almost like, all right, I'm going to go track him down. Okay? And he's going out to meet God at the tent of meeting. Here's the conversation that happens. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you. In order to find favor in your sight, consider too that this nation is your people." Now, without calling upon it right now, what is Moses calling upon God? Hesed. Though, what do the Ten Commandments say? Who would God give Hesed to? Those who love God and keep and obey His commandments. What do we have here? A people who have not obeyed and not kept the commandments. What right does Moses have to call upon God to keep a promise in which the conditions have not been met? That's Hesed. That's Hesed. When you are calling upon somebody, you are usually in a place where they no longer have any kind of obligation or legal obligation. Nobody's tying them to it besides who they are, their nature, and your previous relationship. They're your people, God. Are you really going to do this? Okay, now watch what God's response is. And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. How fast? How fast of a response did we just get? Instant. What is God's determination for saying, you know what, I'm not going with you, I'm going to send an angel to you? And Moses uses some really specific wording. And God responds with, I'm going with you. Right? This isn't just God kind of flip-flopping, by the way. All right, and we're going to see in chapter 34 what's going on. But watch. Okay, so, and he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. And this is Moses' response. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? It is not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth. You see that? There is a unique relationship between us and you, Lord. And how will anybody else know of this unique relationship unless you do this kindness? Unless you fulfill your covenant? Unless you keep your promise? We are your promised people. We are your people. And this is a display to the world that we are truly your people. Now, could God have risen up a new family from stones? Could he not have called a new nation? Right? Yet, God has also promised Hesed. So, though it's conditional, it also goes beyond conditions. Does that make sense? So let's say we're in a normal, I give this example sometimes. And this is why mercy sometimes is chosen as the term to describe it. Me and Ben were having a discussion in which he needed to receive some punishment. Okay? Happens often. But this particular time, I decided to just, you know what, Ben? When we go home, I want you to go in your room. I want you to pull your pants down. I want you to lay in your bed and wait for me to come in and spank you. Which, by the way, I don't spank often, so. And so I go in, and he goes right to his room. And I can see on the monitor, he does exactly what I asked him to do, and he waits. I go in, change my clothes, take off just the waiting, right? Brush my teeth, right? Have a meal. No, I'm just kidding. And I walk in, and all of his expectation is what? That I'm going to spank him. I sit down next to him. And though he didn't call out to me for any kind of kindness or mercy, because he knows that's very unlikely to happen, his whole body language and how he responded, in that moment, I'm like, you know what? Mercy. Love. Loyalty. Showing him, though he deserved something, and I told him I would do it, and we talked about this, you deserved this punishment. You deserved for me to do this thing to you, but I'm not going to do it because I love you. There's a relationship. That's a Hesed. That's not an unconditional love, because unconditional love can still discipline, right? But a kindness that is shown, an action that is done to somebody based upon relationship, whether they deserve it or not sometimes. But it's not, if it's not deserved, it's not expected. That makes sense? If it's not deserved, God has every right to right now destroy all the nation of Israel. And yet he doesn't. Okay? And so we go on to this whole story. Moses asked to see the presence of God, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But look at chapter 34. We got 5 minutes left. And I want you to see what God is going to explain to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, this is after all, he says, I will show you my glory. Moses lights up. The Lord said to Moses, okay, cut for yourselves 2 tablets of stone like the first. I will write the tablets of the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. Be ready by the morning and come up the morning of Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. So now where are we going? We're going back to the mountain. Okay? Which, if you're the people of God, and you already watched 3,000 die, by the way, 3,000 died, and they broke the golden calf up and made it into dust. They put it in the water. He made them drink it, right? He says, no one shall come up with you. Let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite the mountain. Back off. Everybody back away. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first. He rose early in the morning, went up the Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took his hand in 2 tablets. The Lord descended in the cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. Now, what is the name of the Lord? I am who I am. So how he proclaimed the name of the Lord, he's about to give 13 attributes of who God is. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, Adonai, Adonai, a God, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in chesed and faithfulness, keeping chesed for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sins, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshiped. There is this constant balance of God's nature to show abounding, overflowing chesed to his people, while at the same time not allowing transgressions to just be passed by. God is explaining to Moses, what just happened is based upon my character and my nature. What have you learned? What are you learning? And Moses instantly, who boldly before tried to intercede, Lord, no, Lord, questioning God, and immediately he bows down, he falls down to worship God. Okay, so in an aspect of God's chesed, the idea of God looking to forgive and redeem and bring people constantly back in. God is almost begging people to be in his presence. And he shows abounding steadfast love or abounding loyalty or abounding mercy so that people will want to enter in. And Moses bows down and worships. And to me, that's the only response that is worthy of what just happened. Because what should have happened to Israel and Moses immediately? Because what happens with the ruler as death or separation? Or God could have easily said, you know what, I'm sending you away. I'll even send an angel, which he didn't have to do, to watch over you. And he could have wiped his hands clean. And what would have happened to the nation of Israel? If you read their story, they're constantly adverse to all the nations around them. And they're constantly at death's door. And who continues to protect them? God does. Through chesed. When you are in the presence of God, going back to Psalm 138, you have the right to call upon his kindness and mercy, and it's new every morning. If you are far from God, you are outside. He still has his ahava. He loves you. But the promises are no longer yours because his promises are attached to his presence. All right. There's more in here if you want to go through and read and delve into it. Thank you. Most quoted story in all of Scripture, by the way, right here in the rest of the Bible.